Guys, welcome back to our restoration project. So as you can see, we're starting to wind down our 2.0 engine build, and things are starting to look pretty good here. Still have a few small things to do. Today we're going to concentrate on installing our flywheel, clutch, and pressure plate. Should be fairly simple and straightforward to assemble all this. After that, really not much left to do on the top half here to close this thing up and get it lowered to the ground and mate it up with our transmission. So let's go ahead and dive in and see exactly what's involved.
So first let's take a look and see exactly what we pulled out of here when we disassembled. So this is the clutch, and by all appearances it really doesn't look like it has much mileage on it, but it does have some burning and some galling to it. I don't believe this is a high mileage clutch. It looks to me like something they had put in there as a replacement and didn't get very far with it. This guy here looks to be the original pressure plate. You can see all the galling on this surface here, just really in bad shape, but doesn't match up really with what's going on with this guy. So this to me looks like they had just installed a new clutch in here, left the existing pressure plate, and then even our flywheel over here looks to be brand new. I mean, look at the surface on that thing. In really good shape, and this is the one that I pulled out of there. You can see here that there was not much going on there as far as wear goes, but the reason I didn't go with it is because the ring gear had a little bit, let's see if we can focus in on here, a little bit of chipping and some issues there. Not too bad, and this is definitely something I wouldn't be afraid to run with in its condition. Looks to be really nice, but I think for this build at this point it's just really better to install a new one. Alright, and then taking a look and see what we are replacing them with. So our pressure plate here is by Sachs, and also our new clutch here is also by Sachs, and the flywheel is by Sebro, and Sebro makes two versions for this car, one that is dynamically balanced and one that is not dynamically balanced. What dynamic balancing is when they put it on a lathe type machine and spin it at a high rate of speed, they're able to get a much more accurate balancing that way. So this one here is dynamically balanced. And then a close-up look here at our new replacement hardware. So our large screws here, these are new replacements by Porsche. And then also our pilot bearing, this is also a new replacement part by Porsche. Alright, so then getting started then, I have already pre-installed our pilot bearing, and that presses in seats from the backside. We'll lubricate this later. If you don't have a press to push this in, you can do it with a plastic hammer and some backing. So what I used is a large washer, a large socket, and the idea is to put your washer over that guy like that, and then your socket over the bearing, and this is going to be proud of this surface, so when you're tapping on it you have solid backing where you're tapping and you don't have any pressure on this outside edge here. So then what that'll look like, you'll have a socket there, your washer here. This guy will seat right in the center. And you can see now I'm up off of the bench here. So I wouldn't recommend doing this on a bench. You need to be something on very solid, like a cement floor or a very solidly mounted bench vise, and then you can just tap it down in there, working it around, and it'll go and seat. It's not going to be easy, but you can get it to go as long as you have some good solid flat backing. And then our flywheel bolts, these are just going to be oiled on the threads and up under the head there, and we'll torque these down to 150 Newton meters. Okay, Z1 mark will go up, and rubber gloves are a good idea. So as I'm coming in to landing here, I'm just kind of eyeballing my screw hole pattern, which will only allow me to install it in one configuration, but it's tight. If you're off a little bit, it's going to be tough to line up our bolts. And then large washer slash reinforcement plate. And I prefer to run these in by hand before we put any kind of a wrench to it. That way we are for sure seated and centered and don't have anything biting on it at all. That one's just a little bit tighter, but I think it's just more the threads than alignment. Not a whole lot of room to work in there, but it is doable. Okay, now I think we can install our flywheel lock. Okay, so let's have a look at our P215 flywheel lock. So what this does is it sits down into our yoke, bolts into place, and then the idea is that it locks into the flywheel. But you can see here in a current position, it's not going to go. So it's not going to go in there, so we're going to have to rotate our engine slightly clockwise until this drops into place and we can lock the flywheel. We don't want to go counterclockwise because we could end up jamming the chains and that would be detrimental to what we're doing here. So at this point in the game, we only want to go clockwise if we have to rotate the engine. But I do want to double check before we move this thing off TDC, because the last time this engine moved, we were doing our cam timing check. We had our distributor exactly where we want to set it. Let's just double check our distributor one last time before we move this, because once we move it, we won't be able to get back there. Okay, so what we want to double check here before we rotate this engine slightly, we want to make sure we're at number 1 firing, top dead center, and our points are just starting to open to have our timing set to 0 when we initially start this car. So I'm using this really thin feeler gauge here, 0.038 of a millimeter, and that is going to slide right between my point contacts, which tells me we're just slightly open. Then if I check with my next size thicker feeler gauge, 0.127 of a millimeter, that's not going to go. So if we rotate the engine now, it's not going to matter because we know everything is orientated correctly to start this engine. Okay, now we're in pretty good shape. So what's going to happen when we start torquing those screws, we're actually going to be putting pressure on the flywheel to go this direction. So absolutely essential we have our flywheel locked. So before we torque everything down and put our next components into place, I think this would be a good opportunity to talk about our engine stand yoke here, because we're on the back end here, we can really see what's going on with it. So I had a question a while back from one of our viewers, Rob Hurley. Hey Rob, how's it going? Rob was wanting to know, am I using the P201 engine stand yoke to build our engine here? This isn't actually the Porsche P201, but it is a knockoff version, brand unknown. I bought this several years ago off of a vendor on eBay, and it has worked out pretty well for what we're doing here, and is probably very close to the original P201 spec. So it's got to do a couple things for us. One of the things it's got to do, it has to have a relief for our flywheel lock, and our bolt up has to be exactly the same pattern as our engine case there. And then kind of the principle of how this thing works is you can see as we look in close here that the engine case is embedded into the flange, and that goes halfway around. So it's not really 2 bolts that are carrying the weight of this engine. It really is the engine that is sitting right on that lip that is taking most of the weight. I mean, we're drawn up tight with the bolts, but the principle on how this works and is able to hold all that engine weight is by that lip right up against our engine case right there. And then that being said, even though it theoretically is supposed to be able to take all that weight, I prefer to put some support on the cantilevered end here, just to make sure we don't have too much stress on the back end of that case, and I'm able to sleep better at night for that reason. Although you could fully build this engine and those 2 bolts and that lip take the weight of it, I still feel better taking some of the weight with some support up front. Okay, let's go ahead and torque this guy down now. I'm going to do a crisscross pattern for a torque pattern, and then I'm going to be doing 25 Newton meter increments as we go. So I'm going to go 25 Newton meters, 50 Newton meters, 75, and so on until we get to 150 Newton meters all the way around. Okay, and then switching to my half-inch drive torque wrench, as the 150 Newton meters is a little bit much for my 3/8 drive, so let's finish it off with this one. Okay, so as you can see, 150 Newton meters here is just a little bit much for my tool. What I'm going to have to do to get through this is grind this down flat and get a fresh new surface on there, and hopefully be able to finish those screws. Okay, so that didn't really work out like I had hoped. Metal's just a little bit too soft for that kind of torque. So I ordered a Impact M12 spline bit, and that should definitely get the job done, no problem. Let's go ahead and torque it down. Okay, so then moving on then, so I've printed up a page out of the manual, and they're talking about applying a thin film of moly grease at this location here, which is the diaphragm spring between the wire rings. Let's take a look at that and apply a little bit of grease right in there. Alright, so then looking at our pressure plate, so this is the location right in here that they're talking about. Just get a little bit of grease in there. Not gobs and gobs, just enough so you're not metal to metal. Otherwise you could have a little bit of a squeaky clutch there. And if you put too much on there, when this thing spins, it could fling onto your clutch. So got to be careful just to put a thin film right in that area in there. And then we can wipe off any excess. And this grease here was supplied by Sachs, so I'm going to apply this to our pilot bearing. So I'm using new fasteners and a new lock washer. So this is a grade 8. And this is a 10.9, which is a metric reading, which is equivalent to a grade 8. And we're going to Loctite this with 243. The other thing we're going to have an issue with when we try and slide this into place, there are some pegs that locate where this goes, probably here. We may have to drift this over and persuade it a little bit with a hammer and a punch. Otherwise, I don't think we're going to get it to go. Really, really tight. On the bench, it didn't work, so we may have to nudge that a little bit. And then our clutch is labeled, so this side here is going to go towards the gearbox, which is this way. And then we're just going to insert our locating tool. So what this is going to do, let's say we didn't have the tool, this could drift and float anywhere in this area when we tighten it down. But by using this tool, it aligns it with our pilot bearing and puts it dead on center. So we leave that tool in there until we're torqued down, then we pull the tool out. That way, when we hook up our transmission, we slide right into place. All right, well, it looks like everything slid into place, no problem there. So now we're going to take these up to 35 newton meters. I'm going to run them up to 20 first, and then take them to 35, and that should be it. We should have ourselves a clutch installed. Okay, so then theoretically we should be able to pull this tool out of here and our clutch remains centered in the pressure plate. Okay, so then wrapping it up here, we're just double checking our torque is 35 newton meters all the way around. We don't have any Loctite dribbling and running down on the inside of our flywheel here, any grease all cleaned up. Other than that, it went real smooth. The only real challenge here was finding the right tool to take those flywheel screws up to 150 newton meters. Other than that, real simple job, not too difficult to get through. And we can strike one more off our list. We're that much closer to starting this engine. Well, thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next video.